Hello, and welcome to Chapter 3 of Crisis Intervention. This chapter is an overview of Kanel's ABC model. So, in some respects, it's kind of an easier, quicker chapter. In class, we'll do the hands on practice of each step of the model, but the rest of it is kind of an overview. And if you're a human services student, some of this stuff you've at least had conversations about or even practiced somewhat in interviewing principals and record keeping. So, the first part of the ABC model is to develop and maintain rapport. And these are basic sort of things that I think a lot of you will know: eye contact, body positioning, how you use questions, and the manner in which you try to establish relationships with the person coming into the room with you. Has a lot to do with how much you're showing the person that you are tending to them, are caring about them, are engaged with them, are not spacing out and thinking about doing laundry while they're telling you something important. So it does require putting aside all of whatever's going on with you internally to focus on the person in front of you. Probably one of the best ways to do this, and you've heard this, is by using open-ended questions, because the closed ones just kind of, I mean, not that you can't use closed ones or not that they aren't important, but I think really when we're talking about particularly the early phases, you want people to be able to express and explain and give detail. The close-ended questions, although they can provide you with information, don't allow for elaboration, obviously. So, questions to avoid: why? It sounds a little judgy. Why do you feel that way? Or why did you do this? Um, uh, so, try to, if you can avoid those. I know one question I always this avoid would you could you. I was trying to think of a way when I've asked people to talk about their life growing up. I would say something along the lines of, "Okay, grow yourself up for me. Tell me a bit about what it was like. A sort of a summary of your the life up to this point for you. The good, bad, the ugly, all the things that may be important for us to consider and to talk about. Um, and then the other piece, I think the bigger piece down here is about this: don't interpret your questions. When you start like throwing certain feeling words in there, depending on how the context and that you're asking them, it sounds like you're labeling something that the client maybe not had labeled that way. And in that respect, it's possible it may not be a big deal, but you could cause the client to then either talk in the same language that you're using as far as feelings go, um, and maybe not express the feelings that are going on inside of them in a more appropriate way, or in a more accurate way, I should say. Paraphrasing. It's just kind of mirroring back what has been said to make sure that you guys are on the same page, that you and the client are on the same page. It's a quick thing. It's not a don't go on and on and on. It's a quick, succinct rephrasing of what's been said, and somewhat a summary to make sure that you're clear and they are clear as well. Another way to clarify things is by clarifying things. Um, what I would always, one of the ways that I would do this is I would say, just tell me, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this is what I'm hearing. And then I would, um, put it out there as to what I thought I heard. And I just, do I have that right? And let them, you are more the student and they are the teacher of themselves to you. They're the ones who know more about what's going on, and they will cue you in on that sort of stuff. Another one is reflection, reflecting back, um, feelings, um, kisses, keep it simple, stupid. Um, Try to keep the focus on the emotion itself when you're reflecting back the feeling. Like if they, especially if they use a specific feeling word, try to pick up on the client's lingo. That's how you can connect too. Like I had a client who used to call, he'd call his tantrums fits, and so did his parents. And so instead of me calling it a tantrum, which to him had a different sort of connotation, I would use his language and identify what he saw as problematic behavior and what his parents saw as problematic behavior with the same label that they used it, just so that we're all on the same page. And I'm conveying things in the manner that they are as well. Summarization is also a pithy, pithy. Excuse me, another SAT word. Um, Pithy um, statement that ties together all the things that have kind of been outlined to you. These are the sort of the highlights tying them together. Another way, again, another thing to do to make sure that you understand the problem within context. So that's all of A. There's a lot to A. That's really like a lot of ways the meat and potatoes of things. B is identifying the problem, and this has more to do with like some assessment skills and observing the client's behavior as questions are being asked or as they are answering them. Also, to try to identify your reactions of some things too. So, what you're doing is you're kind of examining the thoughts and perceptions. What did you think about that, or what was the meaning of that for you? You're trying to examine those sorts of things with the client because that's really the context of the crisis, right? It's the meaning that we assign to the problem. And that's when you can get into discussions around cognitive distortions, and there's a litany of those. So it's a way to kind of uh, cut through and get to uh, how the client walks away from whatever the situation is, what they take away from it. And of course, when we're getting into that, we're talking about the precipitating event, the thing that occurred to cause the problem to begin with. One of the ways that I try to get to some of this in terms of impact is like, what were things like before the incident? You know, that can give you a little bit of comparison in terms of how they're functioning now post incident. Of course, when you're examining the degree of distress and impairment in functioning, you are going to be looking at how their social life has been impacted, their occupational life has been impacted, academics or behavior. You will get into questions around suicide ideation, homicide ideation, hearing voices, seeing things, that sort of stuff. So, covering your bases in terms of extremes of reactions to the meaning of the event. And that's really where the safety component comes into play. And as I said, you're checking for all these things: suicide, homicide, child abuse, elder abuse. If there's, you really have to take stock as to who's involved when we're talking about the identified client. That doesn't always just mean one person. So that's something to consider too. And also, as far as emotional distress or functioning or adaptive or maladaptive coping mechanisms are concerned, that's when we want to get into things like substance use issues or other behaviors that can be self harming or damaging. In terms of how we show that we are engaged, we validate feelings. Why would you feel that way? Don't say things like that, right? Educate people about, and that could education could be about resources or just knowing that they're not alone in feeling in that way. You know, I've had other clients who've been through a similar circumstance, and this is what they have reported. That might be a way to kind of connect them to, oh yeah, that's right, so good. This is not an unusual thing. Also, to make sure they have a sense of autonomy and empowerment, that they make decisions. Certainly, if they're decisions that there are concerns about safety, you want to have them try to look at them in a pro versus con, or trying to figure out what the purpose, what the outcome they would like to be of their decision. Um, and also reframing. And I have a little exercise that we'll use in class about reframing. Reframing is very helpful, I think, particularly for people who really jump into cognitive distortions. When there's a lot of black and white thinking, it's not unusual to see that, especially post trauma. We all do it to greater or lesser extent at some point in our lives, but a reframe is a nice way to take a different perspective of a situation or a thought. And then the last part is coping, where you are examining both the adaptive and maladaptive attempts to cope. It's all coping, all right? It's all strategy. It's not always good for people, but this is how people try to deal with things. So, in those instances where coping is failing or that it's maladaptive, you are working with the client to develop new and more successful coping behaviors. Maladaptive coping, of course, might be something like someone who's drinking a lot after the loss of a spouse or something along those lines, right? They're trying to deal with it, but they're also sort of opening up the possibility for more problems. Um, and so that's when you're going to get into these looking at alternative coping mechanisms, other ways to deal. Part of that has to do with referrals, what's out there, what's needed, being familiar with the area and the services out there, costs, waiting lists, all that sort of stuff. And so, as a clinician, those are the things you're going to be on top of as you're referring people because you will be communicating with other agencies. So you're going to have a pretty good idea of what places can help at what juncture in the person's life. But I do think the biggest part of that is not just referring, but following up. Checking in to make sure that they got where they were supposed to go, if they need any other services, if they need something instead of what you refer them to. Even a week or two just after you've referred them, just to make sure that they've set up the appointment. And that is it.